a fantastic bit when I do
the big news is, Maclane, is that you made it so we can actually record the show. And I will say, like, the background of your apartment is a lot cleaner than certain corners that I've seen. Not that I'm going to bring that up. This intro is lasting a really, really long time. Welcome back, guys, to another edition of the Big Sky Podcast Network Power Rankings, presented by Tubbs at the Club, which means presented by Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey. That's a typo there with that background. So, hey, I'm your host, Brian Marceau. Patty Frakes is out of commission. He claims he has the flu. I think he's suffering from an acute case of Aaron Best post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's what happens when you're an Eagle. We lived through that in Idaho with Paul Petrino, our fellow co-host, Maclane Westbrook from Jungleland Podcast. Good to have you here, Maclane. You certainly lived through that, various versions of the whatever post-traumatic stress disorder that from different coaches. I think Charlie Reigel may be the name that comes to mind first.
Yeah. So we started the Jungleland Podcast, technically speaking, in the Charlie Reigel year 2022, and it very nearly killed the podcast before it even really got started. I think we made 3 episodes that year, and so we're back now in the Hawkins era. Now I am a little disappointed that Patty's not here because I would have loved to make some Eastern Washington 41-14 jokes, but maybe next time.
If it helps, in the hashtag Only Tubbs Discord, patreon.com/Tubbs at the Club, it costs less than a cup of coffee a month. We definitely beat the hell out of him with that. So, hey, that's the background. Like you guys say, hey, Maclane Westbrook, Jungleland, he's here. This is the first ever, like official Tubbs at the Club, Jungleland crossover, Idaho Brethren on Idaho Brethren, friendly fire in one way or another. You guys know how the power rankings work. So phase 1, contributors, guys like Maclane Westbrook, guys like myself, people who help host and contribute to Big Sky Podcast Network shows, we vote. We've got Big Sky media members who vote as well, guys who cover like the entire conference, people like Coulter Nuanez, but also people who have a slightly more local focus. Let's say, hey, guys like Patty Frakes too. So we average all those out, and then that gives us our teams 12-1. We don't really spend much time poll jockeying on this show because I think that's just a catastrophic waste of time. And hey, Maclane's joining us at 11:22 Mountain Time. It's 10:22 Pacific Time for me. If it's this late, if it's a waste of time, we're largely not going to do it. Ron Lowney in the comments section wants to give a shout out to Cal Poly for beating NAU by 3. Okay, this is shocking to me that this may be some sort of prediction about Cal Poly beating Northern Arizona, because that lets us roll into our first 2 teams that we're going to largely sprint through. Hey, Maclane, I didn't give you the list ahead of time. Who's number 12 and who's number 11?
Well, for number 12, number 11, this was something I brought up last week. Forgive me if how well the stream's going. We're going to see how well my apartment Wi-Fi does here on this stream. But I remember last week I was having trouble with the power rankings, deciding who do you put, Cal Poly or Northern Colorado at number 12. And fortunately, we had ourselves like a reverse playoff game. We were able to see them go head to head this week, and it's rare you see Cal Poly get a blowout win. But they sure did. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Northern Colorado's probably clocking in at 12, and Cal Poly edges them out and gets to 11.
Yeah, so Maclane got it. Northern Colorado 12, Cal Poly 11. The game that is Cal Poly beats Northern Colorado in Greeley 28-7. Real quick, 2 takeaways. Honestly, Northern Colorado is just kind of sad. Ed Lamb's a good coach, and on this show, on Tubbs of the Club, I had thought Northern Colorado had a chance to be like the best of the garbage, like the garbage part of the Big Sky Conference. Not I'm trying to be funny. Like, that's what I thought they could be. They looked frisky defensively early in the year. They had some close games last year. They just can't score. Absolutely cannot score. And this is the team hasn't won a game in since 2022. 5 games in, they're averaging 12 points per game. So there's almost no update you're going to get for the rest of the year from me out of Northern Colorado. Cal Poly cannot defend anyone, and they held Northern Colorado to 87 yards rushing on 36 attempts. The only interesting part to me for Cal Poly here, because Cal Poly's terrible, they're going to lose almost all the rest of their games, is starting quarterback Jaden Jones new starting quarterback Jaden Jones made his return. Jaden Jones was a freshman starter back in 2022, was a promising dual threat, blew out his knee. We hadn't seen the field in a couple of years, but now he's only making it up because the other Cal Poly quarterbacks are doing God knows what. But the story of Jaden Jones, at least like recovering enough to now get back to the field 2 years later, is kind of cool. But that's it. We're done talking about Cal Poly. We've probably spent too long talking about them as well. Number 10, we're going to move to
I don't think we've spent enough time talking about Cal Poly.
We've spent way too long, man. Okay, number 10, top 5, Portland State. One of 2 teams who last week played out of conference games because Weber and Portland State played the first official Big Sky Conference game earlier this year. And top 5, Portland State loses at Chattanooga 45-30. The game honestly was not as close as the box score indicates to me, as you know, at half, like the halftime score is 38-19. So, I mean, whatever, not that much of a change. Only real takeaways. Maclane, I promise you'll be off the shelf in a second. Portland State cannot really pass that well. They can run once in a while. Dante Sastre, quarterback, passed for 306 yards, but also threw 2 picks on the ground. Quincy Craig is running back to remember for Portland State, rushed 10 times for 103 yards. Sastre rushed 10 times for 41 yards and 2 touchdowns. But Portland State got their ass kicked like they have in virtually every game this year. Their only winnable game, honestly, on paper is Week 12 against Northern Colorado, where we get another shot potentially at 2 teams with no wins and some. Sorry, Cal Poly had a win, but it was D2, doesn't count.
Hey, game against Western Oregon is good stuff.
Tell me about that, Maclane. You should know a bit about that, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, we're done talking about Portland State. Just watch them Week 12. Instead of Cat Grizz, pay attention to top 5 Portland State UNC to close the year. Number 9. Now something interesting to actually talk about here, and you're going to be off the shelf in 10 seconds, I promise. Eastern Washington and Montana. This was Eastern Washington's Super Bowl. We're going to talk about the Eastern end of this. Eastern goes down 52-49, but this was a wild game. The first takeaway to look at, Maclane, before I throw it to you, up and down affair. Montana gains 697 yards of total offense, which say that Eastern gave up that, but Eastern gained 551. So we truly had over 1,200 yards of offense in this game, which is just astounding. I'm going to get to Patty's takeaways on this in a second. Patty Frakes in the comment section. He was there. Again, allegedly he has the flu, but he could go to games outside yesterday, right, Maclane?
That's suspicious.
Maclane, your quick takeaways on Eastern going down 52-49 at home to Montana.
Yeah, well, like you said, this was a crazy game. It was fun to watch. I caught the end of it as I was at work, so the screen had Alabama, Georgia on, and then I was watching this game at the same time, and they had like both crazy endings to them too, as the Grizz kind of stage a comeback and then don't, or Eastern tries to come back. The interesting thing about you mentioned the amount of yardage is that it was pretty evenly split between passing and rushing. The Grizz had 364 passing yards, 333 rushing yards. Eastern had 288 passing yards and 263 rushing yards. So it was just not a ton of defense, I guess, being played. It was a good offensive game in a 52-49 game.
Nearly 1,300 yards accrued between the two teams, and there wasn't much defense, really.
Yeah. So it was a fascinating game to watch. Eastern putting up 28 points in the fourth quarter, and Montana, they're at that point in the season still where Grizz fans think that they stink, but they're still ranked high and they still have a great record at 4-1 now after this.
We'll get further into the Grizz end later,
right.
Hey, Patty's takes really quick on the Eastern game. Patty was there, and Maclane, you hit the story. is Eastern came roaring back, scoring 28 points in the fourth quarter. Grizz fans were terrified that the come apart was going to materialize into a loss, but just couldn't quite happen. Patty's take. Eags got completely out-schemed for an entire half and still had the talent to fight their way back into the game against a top 15 team after being down 31-14 at halftime. Defensively, Eastern screwed themselves time and time again scheme-wise. Eags got absolutely owned by the UM coaching staff on the money downs, which look at Eastern Washington. We're very close to not even talking about Eastern on the show very much. They're riding a 4-game losing streak. Eastern's on bye this week, but have a Maclane, have you looked at Eastern's remaining schedule at all? If you haven't, I forgive you.
Hold on. I haven't looked at it closely. I was previewing the remaining
Don't worry about it. I can tell you. So they're riding a 4-game losing streak. Here's the next 4-5 weeks. By this week, so that doesn't count. Followed by at Sacramento State, then hosting UC Davis, then at Idaho, then hosting Montana State. An 8-game losing streak, Micah. An 8-game losing streak is what you should bet on right now for Eastern Washington. Hey, I stopped at Montana State because there's a little bit of an intermission with Northern Colorado in 6 weeks from now.
Not a guaranteed win for Eastern.
No, but I mean, then the last 2 games of the year on paper now, like Eastern's probably not favored against Idaho State or Northern Arizona right now. So honestly, Eastern is looking at 2 to 3 wins on the season as potential, like completely on the table, which the team is far more talented than that. This has, with a new coaching staff next year, has a huge turnaround written all over them, but it's not next year for a while. We don't wish away the football season unless our team is doing what Eastern's doing. So we're done talking about Eastern. Before we get to number 8, a team that Maclane knows a little bit about, got to talk to you guys about Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey. And look, Snake River is one of the best buys in Idaho State liquor stores. Just bar none. So it's a 3-grain Canadian whiskey, 80% corn, 10% rye, 10% malted barley, double barrel finish, first fill bourbon, and then it's finished in an Oloroso sherry casks. That's your entry level Snake River Stampede, which at $26.95 to me is clearly one of the best buys in the Idaho State liquor stores. Fantastic intersection of a very good product. Honestly, the entry-level Snake River is probably like the first or second best Canadian whiskey you can buy in Idaho State liquor stores, and only $26.95. So if you haven't done it yet, get to your local liquor store, grab yourself a Snake River Stampede. Number 8. Maclane, were you at this game?
I unfortunately was not. I don't have, since moving after college graduation, I don't have the opportunity to get to as many ISU games as I used to.
I should probably enunciate for listeners. This game means Montana State traveling to Pocatello to play at Holt Arena. Yeah, I know it has a different name. I'm not giving it up. It's Holt Arena. So Montana State travels to Holt Arena, Pocatello, plays Idaho State. Idaho State goes down 37-17, although Montana State scored a very late touchdown, correct?
It was no time was on the clock and they ran one in.
Okay. Good Lord. Yeah. Rushed 8-yard touchdown run on their final play.
They did not kick the extra point. They ran it in. Ref said game over.
Okay. Montana State did what they usually do, but hey, we're talking about the Idaho State end. Last week, Idaho State had looked. They ran the ball a little bit more than usual. This week, I mean, they rushed 20 times for 75 yards. Not that big a change. Kobe Tracy, quarterback, went 17 for 33, 183 yards and 2 touchdowns. But hey, look, Montana State's probably the most complete team in the Big Sky Conference. We'll talk about that later. I guess the bigger issue for the Bengals is they're an offensive. Their identity is offense right now, and they got 276 yards. Going to be hard for a team like that to win. But hey, Idaho State. Your takeaways from what you saw?
Yeah, you're right. Idaho State is supposed to be an offensive team with a middling defense right now. That's kind of what they were last year, and that's kind of what they're supposed to be this season. But this game was a lot similar to the North Dakota game a couple weeks ago for ISU, in that the offense had a really slow start, and the defense didn't do bad. Like, we were down 17-0 at half, or rather, hold on.
17-7.
17-7. We got that score just before halftime. So at first we were down 17-0. So the defense was keeping it in there. One of those scores came off ugly Hunter Hayes interception, but the offense just was not clicking. Tracy was not getting time behind the line. Offensive line has been perhaps the biggest issue for ISU this season so far. We saw it against Oregon State, obviously, and against Northern Colorado. So a slow start. Defense does enough to keep you in it for a while, but if the offense isn't able to really get clicking, there's only so much they can do when they're staying out there on the field. And we saw them in the fourth quarter. Montana State scored on a uncovered faked play, a throw to the receiver that was no one around him for miles. I believe the linebacker bit on a run is how Hawkins explained it, and thought he was going to stop the run play and completely blew the coverage on that. So there was that when we were right there. We were, I think, 7 points down when that happened. And so Montana State, a little bit closer than the score indicated, along with that garbage time touchdown. And obviously it was 17-10 at the start of the fourth quarter. So ISU was in a position to win, but like against North Dakota, offense was not clicking enough to complement a defense that was putting together a pretty solid performance, even without Calvin Pitcher. And I think I think it might have been Cortland Horton that was also out, but there was a couple guys out on defense. They still put together a solid performance against Montana State score-wise. At times it didn't feel like they were only down by 17, but Montana State was able to gain 269 rushing yards as a team, and Tommy Mellott only threw 142 passing yards. So basically the kind of game you'd expect from Montana State, predominantly run-focused. And I think Idaho State so far this season has done a better job at making halftime adjustments, one, but also slowing down run games, if not completely stopping them. It's just been the offensive line wasn't able to give Tracy enough time to look comfortable out there. The first half, he had a lot of overthrows. The first few drives of the game, I hate to say this, but he looked really bad out there, and that wasn't necessarily his fault. But Tracy won the starting job because he looked very, very solid. He looked composed against Oregon State and even against North Dakota State. Even when he wasn't making throws, he still had good composure. But we didn't see a lot of that in the first half, especially the first quarter against Montana State. But I would expect Tracy to be the starter going forward and having Hunter Hayes work in on more package plays. That was another thing. Hunter Hayes didn't look as good this game. I think he was 3 for 8, and then he had that interception. But usually Hunter Hayes performs well when he comes in those package plays.
Yeah, to put it very succinctly, because Maclane, you did a good job running through a lot of takeaways this game. Idaho State, and I'm stealing Patty Frake's observation, is defensively Idaho State looks a lot more physical this year than we saw last season. And as you referenced, it's 17-7 at the start of the fourth quarter. That's not bad. Montana State's a very good team. No one this year would say the benchmark for ISU being, having a good year is making the playoffs or something like that. But I mean, hey, they're interesting to me. And if they're able to be a little bit more physical on the defensive side of the ball, then you can understand how. I mean, that's the Bengals route to picking up a few extra wins, which in year 2, that's the goal, right? Pick up a few extra wins, prove year 1 the optimism wasn't a fluke, stay interesting, show that you're developing, and that's how, for I think a team at Idaho State's level, that's how it works. No, moving on to number 7, Weber State. We're not going to talk about Weber State that much because Weber State's a bit of a mess. Look, they hosted McNeese. The Big Sky connection there is a former Grizz quarterback Clifton McDowell runs a show at McNeese. And this is the second close Weber loss, where I really think the takeaway from the Weber State fan base is Mickey Mental, come on. Like, if we're going to take a step back defensively, we have to be showing something extra on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't know, just Weber looks lost. They were a preseason, a pretty sexy team to predict is likely, you're thinking competing for the playoffs. The belief was that with Richie Munoz under center, that the whole quarterback thing was resolved, because that's what it looked like in 2023. And look, Munoz, again, like, okay, threw 2 touchdowns, but, took 30 pass attempts to get 129 yards. Not what I'd call lighting the world on fire. Running back Damon Bankson, 21 carries for 140 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's a game. And we know Damon Bankson healthy is one of the best. He's one of the best running backs in the Big Sky. But it's another kind of heartbreaking loss for Weber State, who they sit at 2-3 on the year now. And moving from that to the playoffs is a pretty big jump. Anything you want to add on Weber State?
I just to go off of that, Weber State is anytime Weber State looks like Idaho State might have a chance against them, I'm thrilled. But it's kind of similar. It reminds me of Eastern Washington, because it's a team that's been a contender in the Big Sky for so long, now having this kind of drop off. And if Patty Ferks has an Aaron Best flu, I don't know what Weber State fans are having right now. I don't know how they're getting by, but it looks like it could be a rough season the rest of the way for Weber. Obviously, they have a win against perennial powerhouse, top 5 Portland State. So that's something you can hang your hat on. But they play Montana next. And if you're a Grizz fan, you're probably hoping that this is a get-right game for the Grizz as much as they need a get-right game. But Weber's got Montana. They do play Northern Colorado after that. But like you said, not a ton of opportunities to get into the playoffs just with the rest of their schedule.
Yeah, so Ron Lowney in the comment section saying kicker for Weber needs to come through. Not second straight week, but this is the second game where Weber State comes out on the short end, where special teams execution would explain Weber sitting at 2 extra wins right now. So, and his other take, they dink and dunk too much. And hey, the Munoz passes 30 times for 129 yards. That it's hard to have any takeaway beyond that. Number 6, we're going to talk about 2 teams at once, because we get to do this once in a while in Big Sky play. Sacramento State and NAU. So Sac State sits at number 6. NAU sits at number 5. And spoiler alert, the reason NAU sits at number 5 is they handled Sacramento State. Brian Wright has turned Northern Arizona into I'm going to use the dreaded F word, frisky, Big Sky team. The NAU sits at 3-2, but we know that's bullshit. They played Lincoln week 1. That's actually 2-2, but sit at 1-1. It's at 1-0 in Big Sky play, dominating 34-16 win, which included leading at the end of the third quarter 27-9. And hey, so what was the NAU route to this win? Hey, they picked off Sac State quarterback Carson Conklin twice, outgained the Sacramento State by 135 yards, and kind of surprising for what NAU's done, because most of the season NAU's been more effective on the ground. But Ty Pennington, man, at quarterback, goes 21-25, 240 yards and 2 touchdowns. Part of why that's shocking is last couple weeks, Sacramento State had just been abusing. Now, I know they weren't very good teams, but Sac had just been piling up TFL after TFL after TFL the last couple weeks. And Sac still did get a healthy number of TFLs on this game. Maclane, after I throw it to you, I can give you the exact count, but it didn't matter. I mean, again, Northern Arizona dominated this game, and surprising, it was through the air that Northern Arizona did their most damage. Maclane, takeaways for you on either end of NAU or Sac State.
Yeah, well, this is another team like Sac State, like Weber and Eastern, is a team that's usually near the top of the standings, but now is having a rough year. So this was a close game at half. It was 10-9, NAU leading, and then they score 17 points in the third quarter to really put it away. Now, in Northern Arizona every year, I feel like, is a really hard team to tell if they're good or not, because they'll get like a really good win against like Montana or Sac State, and then they'll not do much else the rest of the season. So they're always kind of sticking in the middle of the standings. You mentioned they got that win against Lincoln, which doesn't count. Their only other win came against Utah Tech. They won that. They hung in there with Arizona for a while. But
they were confusing last week with Incarnate Word, but like NAU had 9 effective turnovers in the game against Incarnate Word when you factor in failed 4th down conversions too. So in spite of 9 turnovers, NAU was actually relatively close in the Incarnate Word game. They lost, and on paper it was not a close loss. But it's hard to gauge NAU. Again, the first-year head coach Brian Wright, so hey, that is different. But I don't know, man. I don't think there's any way NAU isn't at least getting votes in the top 25. And they're going to travel to Idaho, for Idaho's homecoming. So that's a Big Sky game to pay attention to. Patty Frakes saying NAU got some crazy pressure. And look, you can see that in Carson Conklin, starting quarterback for Sacramento State, has looked like a pretty good passer a lot of the time when he gets to play long enough to establish a rhythm. 17-36, 1 touchdown, 2 picks, 162 total yards. That's a lot of pass attempts to get to 162 yards while also throwing 2 picks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if NAU can just win the turnover margin and play like decent football, then they can coast into a like top 25 position. So that's not bad for them.
Yeah, and still kind of wild for me to think about this because Sac State is still defensively getting penetrations what they do. Sac State still had 7 TFLs this game, but again, Sac State's dominated. Patty Frakes saying that's a really solid offensive line in Sacramento too. That is Patty referencing that NAU is able to get a good amount of pressure on Carson Conklin. My broad takeaway here is it's been hard to take Sacramento State 100% seriously since probably halfway through last year. We've said on this show that had Sacramento State held on week 1 against San Jose State, the narrative about Sacramento State would be essentially the same narrative about Idaho right now. And Sacramento State should have won week 1, but they didn't. And now we get a game like this where no one truly knows how to gauge NAU yet, Maclane. So hey, keep that in mind. Grain of salt takeaways talking about Sacramento State. But I just think Sacramento State's kind of outed themselves as sneaking into the playoffs in the first round is 100% the ceiling of this team if things actualize. Northern Arizona, though, I don't know. I don't know if they have playoff potentiality on this team. 100% this is a team that can be a playoff spoiler. 100% NAU can be a team that let's say, hey, Idaho's a reference point. If Idaho loses against Northern Arizona next week, then suddenly the idea of Idaho hosting a playoff game is in jeopardy. I think NAU is going to be a kind of team that's they're going to ruin someone's playoff plans in one way or another. Yeah,
and for Sac State, their only 2 wins came against Nichols and then Texas A&M Commerce. You mentioned that collapse against San Jose State. I don't know. It's weird. They play Eastern next week, so I don't know if we'll really learn anything about them.
Sacramento State's on bye this week too.
Oh, okay, that's right.
So
they play Eastern
next.
2 weeks. Yeah. And of course, we'll see how they perform when they move up to the FBS soon. But it'll be interesting to see how Sac State does the rest of the way because the first part of the schedule has been not great.
For the record, of course, Sac State has not actually moved up. With Sac State, the takeaway it's been kind of hot cold. We'll reference the actual schedule itself later on, but hey, conference season is 1 week old, so they sit it in the big part of their schedule that matters. Sac State sits at 0-1. NAU sits at 1-0, and we've got a few other teams to talk to that are to me now. Look, hey, there's only 4 teams left, right? So there was definitely some reshuffling, but we have to talk about something else first. Show sponsor Hughes River Expedition. Look, if you're looking for a great all-inclusive week-long vacation, don't look past your backyard. Hughes River Expeditions has been Vandal-owned and operated since 1976 and are ready to take you on the vacation of a lifetime. Enjoy a multi-day trip down the Middle Fork of the Salmon, the main Salmon River no return, the Salmon River Canyons, or the Selway. Check out special trips like the one to see the Perseid meteor shower. Camp on pristine beaches. Run amazing whitewater, hike scenic trails, spot wildlife, soak in beautiful natural hot springs, and fish some of the most remote stretches of river in the country. You just bring your clothes, let HRE handle the rest. So grab a paddle, catch dinner, and ride the bull all throughout the Gem State. Call them now, 406-540-4450, or check them out at hughesriver.com. Number 4, Montana. Look, we already talked about Montana held on for a 52-49 win over Eastern. We already hit on the fact of around 1,300 total yards of offense accrued in this game. the Montana end that I want to focus on. Logan Fife, transfer from Fresno State, starts due to Keelili Ayat's injury last week. And I got to say, I think Logan Fife may have put a stranglehold on that position with the performance against Eastern. Passes for 364 yards. Now, if you want to say, well, the Grizz had 700 yards. Why is that a big deal? Well, because Fife also threw 5 touchdowns. That's also kind of a big deal, too. Also rushed 5 times for 22 yards. Junior Bergen for Eastern, another big game, 7 catches, 150 total yards and a receiving touchdown. Eric Barker catches two touchdowns. Running back Nick Ostmo rushes for 160 yards and a touchdown while also catching a touchdown, 2 receptions for 33 yards. Kind of wild to see the Grizz give up 49 points, because this is a team that you kind of think defense first. But, I mean, hey, just keep in mind, Montana is the Eastern Super Bowl year in, year out. So there is a slightly different level of energy there. I think the big story for Montana is the fact that it looked like the Grizz really wanted to faceplant this game away, but were able to hold on. But your takeaways, Maclane, from the Montana end of the 52-49 win.
Yeah, if I were a Grizz fan, I wouldn't be too concerned about how this game worked out. I know last week they had the slow start against WCU, and then this week they let Eastern crawl back into it. And so you have kind of, if there are moral victories, then Grizz have had some moral losses these last couple weeks. But they're getting the win still. And Montana's never won on the red turf. That was a big storyline of the game, is that they haven't beat Eastern on the red in the Inferno. And so the fact that they were able to hold on to that lead and win and stave off the comeback, I think is good. You can maybe put that up to a fluke and say, yeah, it was just a tough game. Not quite a shootout, I'd say, since it was Montana up 31-14 at half, and then Eastern just kind of crawls back into it. So not quite a shootout, but a crazy offensive game here. So this is a lot of stats, not a lot of defense, and from a hard-nosed Bobby Hawk team, not necessarily what you would expect. But if I were a Grizz fan, I'd err on the side of saying this game was kind of fluky, and the Grizz are better than allowing Eastern scoring 49 points.
Yeah, so you hit what I think is fair to talk about, maybe throw an asterisk about broad takeaways from the Grizz end. I already talked about the Logan Fife thing, so hey, bracket that separately. I'm going to lean on Patty here again, where what he saw out of the Montana defensively is UM's defense isn't nearly the same level as last season. Ron Lowney saying their secondary can't cover or tackle. Now, Ron may be talking about Eastern. Patty separately made a joke about hey, pump the brakes on Fife. He was throwing 2 wide open receivers damn near all night. But the thing I'm going to point to here that I think Montana fans should probably be a little bit anxious about, that Bobby Hawk teams, Montana known famously for being tough, physical, in your face, whatever aggressive terms you want to use, those are typically the terms that Bobby Hawk teams want to have their identity be. And against Eastern, allowed 263 rushing yards on 39 attempts. There was one, and in that there was one long run by Jared Taylor, quarterback, a 48-yard touchdown run. Otherwise, the Grizz just couldn't really stop the run against Eastern. So I guess that my bigger takeaway from Montana is, hey, big deal. They came away with a win, but I think that we've seen other games. I don't think the offensive output's not going to be representative of Montana, moving forward. But I am a little anxious if I'm a Grizz fan about does this defense have another level they can get to? Because that's what Montana has hung their hat on for a very long time. And Patty's saying Eastern dominated on the line of scrimmage. That's, if I'm a Montana fan, if I'm trying to say, if I want to know what does this game mean about playing Montana State later in the year, or hey, Montana's the playoff team. So thinking about future matchups later in the season, I think defensively this Grizz team they're just not going to be as strong defensively as they were last year. I think the jury's in there.
And you kind of saw that when they lost against North Dakota, and so it's like they face a top 25 team, they end up losing in Grand Forks, and so kind of figuring out the Grizz here in the first part of the schedule.
Yeah, I know these are just broad stats, but Montana defensively right now is the number 7 defense in the Big Sky Conference as far as total yards is concerned. And that is with an OOC that the rest of the conference would murder to have. So I think the defensive flaws is not going away. I think that is part of who Montana is. Next, we get to do another one of these where you get to bash 2 teams at once. Idaho, number 3. UC Davis, number 2. Which means, of course, Idaho travels to Davis, loses 28-26. Maclane, I watched this game and recorded a full episode for it, so I obviously have some takeaways from here. But, hey, I want to talk to you before I do my Idaho data dump. Your takeaways from Idaho going down at Davis.
The first interesting takeaway is that for the first time I was able to confidently in the power rankings put UC Davis above Idaho, which felt weird, but they had a 4-1 record, and now they have the head-to-head win against Idaho. And so I can't argue with that. So UC Davis, obviously they're without Dan Hawkins any longer, as he's now living in Pocatello.
He's taken a step up.
Yeah, exactly. He's moved up to greener pastures. But UC Davis doesn't seem to have really gone backwards at all. They were able to put up 286 yards passing in this game. That includes Lan Larison going 3 for 3 for 38 yards, and then Miles Hastings putting up 248 yards. Only had 28 total yards rushing. Now that's including a couple losses negative rushing yard. But they were able to Idaho's got a tough defense, and I think they've shown that throughout their schedule. They've faced opponents better than UC Davis. Like they, hung in there with number 3 Oregon for 4 quarters or 3 quarters and 3/4 of a quarter. But interesting part was that UC Davis got it done passing the ball, and that's been part of UC Davis's identity since the Hawkins were there. That's something that Cody and Dan have brought over to Idaho State. And so I think UC Davis was kind of able to overcome that tough Idaho defensive line. For Idaho, they had 274 yards passing and 34 total yards rushing. So this was a pass happy game. Not a ton of rushing yards in this game. It's weird to me that Idaho.
Well, pause real quick. Idaho rushed for 185 yards.
Oh, sorry. I looked at the wrong
34
number.
attempts, 185 yards.
34 attempts, 184 yards. So they did have a much better time rushing the football. I don't know. Okay. It was a hyphenated name that bumped the stats over on there. But I think it's interesting from an Idaho perspective because there was a lot of discussion this year because they were at a lot of the top of the preseason polls, or they were near the top in a lot of those preseason polls. And they come out against Oregon week 1, a game that they had no business being in, or any FCS team should have no business being in. And they make it a game. And they come out the next week, they beat Wyoming. They exercised the demons against UAlbany. They beat Abilene Christian in a game that was closer than it should have been. And so, I don't know. It was kind of interesting at the start of the season. It was tough to tell what to make of Idaho because a lot of people thought they took a step back. And I've heard even Vandal fans say that, Montana fans say that. So it's been an interesting season for them because they go toe-to-toe against FBS teams like Oregon and Wyoming. They beat Wyoming. And then they lose to UC Davis, and I don't know. It's sort of interesting figuring who they are.
I can enlighten you on a couple of these things. Idaho was 3/4 of the way through. Idaho's backup quarterback Jack Wagner goes down, does not return. Third stringer, who actually might be 4th stringer, but it had Holden B not been injured before the season started. Nick Josephek takes over. And so Idaho offensively is down to their 3rd string quarterback. I bring this up because the Vandals are only scoring about 25 points a game. Like they're just offensively, they're not putting that much on the board. This is a defense first team. But hey, enunciating the further offensive struggles. Idaho was also their two best linemen, Keyshawn James Newby and Dallas Afalava. They were limited, as like they essentially had a pitch count due to injury for how many plays they're going to be out there. Idaho also turns the ball over essentially 5 times, 2 on failed 4th down conversions where Idaho was within field goal range, twice went for it on 4th down and didn't convert. And hey, you know the math. Idaho loses by 2, right? 2 times they don't kick a field goal. 3 points twice over. So like, hey, Idaho could easily have won the game in that regard. So look, if you're a Vandal, to me, the takeaway is Idaho. Look, hey, Idaho's outcoached. Love Jason Eck, but the staff was outcoached at UC Davis. That's where the loss comes from. Lots of things went against Idaho's way, many of them self-inflicted, and it was a 2-point game. So that's the Idaho end. I think is we know that we know defensively Idaho's strong. Miles Hastings did show that if Idaho's going to be exposed defensively, it's going to be in the secondary. It's going to have to be through the pass game because Land Larison was completely stopped in the run game. And honestly, even some of the yardage Land Larison accrued, he's the only Big Sky running back who's going to do it. Larison is great at making space when there is none. Most backs don't have the ability to do that, but Miles Hastings had moments where he absolutely cut Idaho apart, and Idaho offensively, they've been relying on big plays to score the entire year. Idaho essentially had no offense whatsoever from about 5 minutes into the second quarter until about 5-ish minutes left in the fourth quarter. Which was like half a game of absolutely nothing on the offensive side of the ball. The Davis end, real quick before I throw it back to you, is defensively, Davis is for real. Both the Connors brothers are back. That matters for UC Davis. And offensively, Davis is pretty dang versatile. Now, we did see a take Patty Frakes has that I agree with is Davis's O-line is not quite as imposing as it has been in previous years, which is to me part of why, in spite of Idaho just shooting themselves in the foot the way they did offensively, just making it, Idaho did not do their own defense any sort of favors. Davis was never able to truly blow this game open in spite of being able to move the ball through the air very well. So UC Davis is a good team. They look like a playoff team for sure, but from the Idaho and Davis end at the same time, this is an example of a game where I'd say, hey, if I'm UC Davis Aggie winning at home like this with this many, Idaho having this many mistakes, I want no part of a rematch with Idaho in the playoffs. Or from the Vandal end, your take is, nope, I want Davis again. I want Davis. Idaho threw this game away. I felt watching this game, if Idaho played Davis 10 times, the Vandals probably win 8 of them, but they only play once. So this is where we're at.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You point out that it was still only a 2-point loss, even with all of those self-inflicted errors for the Vandals. And again, it goes back to, well, how good is Idaho now? Are they still as good as they were predicted in the preseason or what? I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about is how good you think Idaho's offensive line is, because with all of the injuries at quarterback, you're getting into like Idaho State levels, how many quarterbacks you're having play in the season. So
Idaho's down 2 O-line starters, but honestly, O-line was a relative weakness for Idaho for sure in 2023. And look, Idaho does not have like Montana State O-line by any means, but look, Idaho's acquitted themselves fine on the offensive line. They lost starting quarterback Jack Lane week 1, so Idaho's had to rely on backups, for like the Wyoming win, for this game where Idaho should have won. We were down to the 3rd string quarterback, right? For the most part, Idaho's been pretty good. And if you don't buy this, I accept it with how many QB injuries the Vandals have. They've actually kept their quarterbacks upright for the most part. Idaho has not had to have Jack Wagner, make his place surviving while on the run the way Giovanni McCoy did last season. That just hasn't been the case. So it's been I think the O-line has taken a clear step up from last season, but there's some other issues that have been mitigating factors. Like, hey, Idaho's wide receivers, they're dropping way too many passes. Some of it's because with the backup quarterback, the accuracy is not there. But like a second week in a row, wide receiver Mark Hamper has a touchdown bounce off his chest or hands. So, and again, hey, 2-point game, right? That play goes differently, Maclane. Idaho wins this game. So that's
Yeah.
just how it's been. But until Idaho's going to start scoring points, like they're for a good team, they're going to be riding a razor's edge more than you would guess.
Yeah, and it's been a frustrating season as an Idaho Vandals hate watcher. If seeing them in these games that they should be losing, they end up winning. And this one is one that they should have won that they ended up losing. From the schedule point of view, UC Davis has an interesting couple matchups coming up because they have the inverse of ISU's next matchups. They play Portland State, Cal Poly, Eastern, and Northern Colorado their next 4 games. And so they could have a playoff spot already secured at the start of November.
Yeah, they're gonna. Now the end for UC Davis is Montana State, Sac State, but you're right. The Aggies sit right now have 4 FCS wins. There's no way that they don't pick up their next 4. So they'll be riding an 8-game. Davis should be riding an 8-game winning streak before traveling to Montana November 9th. So hey, real good point to bring up. And hey, on this show, we've talked about how Miles Hastings can be, as a quarterback, can be hot, cold. He was very good against Idaho. Hastings picked apart Idaho for about 2/3 of this game when he could. Hastings did as good a job as we've seen any quarterback do in picking apart the Idaho secondary. Now, to be fair, in spite of what I just said, it still only gained 200, only accrued 248 yards. So just want to hold that at the same time. Hastings was the best looking quarterback against Idaho's defense so far this year, and still like that resulted in fewer than 250 yards. So take from that what you will. My big takeaway is both these two teams are very good football teams, and I expect to see both of them in the playoffs.
I'm interested in the fact that UC Davis doesn't seem to be that affected immediately by the departure of Dan Hawkins. The interesting point about that was that originally Dan Hawkins had stepped down as coach of UC Davis and said it was a sort of retirement where he was still going to be with the team as like an assistant or an advisor. And then he just completely moves over and joins his son's coaching staff. And so that kind of interesting exit strategy doesn't seem to have affected UC Davis that much. They're still winning. No. Maybe their offense isn't quite where they want to be, but.
Well, first-year coach Tim Plow's been an OC in the Big Sky for a very long time. He's a pretty well-respected guy, so it's not. It's not shocking to me that we have not yet seen any sort of step down. Like when it's his own recruiting classes, then things become a little bit different, right? But we're not there yet. And hey, Ron Lowney, he knows we got another team we got to talk about. Before we get there, patreon.com/Tubs the Club to support the show. Yeah, I know some of you guys are not Vandals, but if you do, we have threads in our Discord that talk about non-Idaho games. So it's a completely worthwhile place to be. And hey, it costs less than a cup of coffee. Support the show. If you're a Vandal, I don't know how you're not already in there, especially on road games. The Discord chat, wire to wire, it's just constant. Best place to talk Vandal sports online, not remotely close. And check out our new Substack at thetubstack.com or tubstheclub.substack.com. Jeffrey Ledeker is putting out a few articles each week. It's a new thing we're doing at Tubbs. Check out both. Franklin Spicer, yes, Tim Plow was fired from Boise State, but Andy Avalos also essentially didn't let him do anything. So, hey, Andy Avalos.
I think that's fired, right? Franklin's Boise bias coming through.
Sure. And his Boise bias should be like, yeah, Andy Avalos had no idea what in God's name he was doing. So
that I think he'll agree with you on.
Okay, done talking about that. Last team we got to talk about is Montana State, who, hey, we already covered. Montana State beats Idaho State.
Yeah, I thought we weren't going to have to talk about this again.
37-17. The offensive end for Montana State, Tommy Malott goes 10-17, 142 yards and a touchdown. Was sacked once, which I bring that up because Montana State has pretty much kept Malott upright most of the year. Malott did rush 6 times, counting the sack, for 26 yards and a touchdown. So, hey, Malott hits the ground 5 times this game. Again, pretty good there. Montana State's keeping the dude healthy. Scott Trey Humphrey leads the – look, Montana State rushed for 268 yards on the game. Scott Trey Humphrey leads the way, 27 rushes for 159 yards and 3 touchdowns, including the last second one. So now the Montana State end of traveling to Pocatello, Holt Arena, Quarter Corners, and coming away with a W. Your takeaways on Montana State.
So kind of like I mentioned, this was Montana State is living up to the identity that they had, a rushing team that can also throw the ball if they need to. They didn't need to a ton in this game, but like you said, they've kept Tommy Mellott upright. Another concern, I think, with Mellott was injuries and stuff, and so far that hasn't been a problem this year. He's a tough guy, as the broadcast mentioned many times. Tough kid from Butte, Montana. But it was I don't know, because they obviously they won by 20. Well, I won't bring up the last touchdown again, but it's still kind of a close game. If you're Montana State, I think you'd want to win this one a little bit more convincingly, especially because going into it, you had a 4-0 record against New Mexico, Utah Tech, Maine, and Mercyhurst. Now, an FBS win is an FBS win, but New Mexico is one of those FBS programs where we think a top-tier FCS program can compete with them. But I don't know. Montana State hasn't necessarily had the stiffest competition yet, and I include Idaho State in that.
Sure.
They will be playing Northern Colorado next. And then, of course, they have the game against Idaho, and that's going to be – is that one of the ESPN games?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, as it probably should be. That's going to be a good game where we'll sort out some of the Big Sky standings again. But, yeah, I don't know. This was kind of what you would expect from Montana State. Just they were in control the entire time, and even though it was kind of close, a lot of the times it didn't feel that close. So Montana State was able to get pressure on defense, keep ISU from effectively passing the ball. Also stopped an Idaho State run game that was getting a little frisky the last couple weeks.
That dreaded F word here.
Yeah. Idaho State's been running the ball better this year than they were last year, but Montana State was able to slow that down and, again, put pressure on the quarterback and they won the game how they like to win games, which is take control of time of possession and be able to run the ball.
Now, the one thing I'm going to say, Ron Lowney in the comment section, before I start saying some nice stuff about Montana State, the schedule critique is absolutely fair. Like the Montana State right now, like Idaho's about to have their fourth consecutive ranked very likely with NAU. I expect NAU is going to be top 25. If that's the case, that's going to be the fourth consecutive FCS ranked game for Idaho. The Montana State side, they do have the FBS win at New Mexico, but otherwise I haven't played anyone who's flirting with the top 25. So we do need to enunciate that.
They're beating them by a lot, which they should be. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Montana State's murdering teams. They're winning games by an average of around 20 points a game. Like on season, Montana State's scoring 39 a game. Yeah. They're surrendering 18 a game. What do we call that? We call it a blowout. But the thing that I want to point to that I think if you're Montana State, you say, okay, well, again, sure, these teams are cupcakes, but whatever, this is not nothing. Mellott's completing just under 70% of his passes. Does Montana State ask him to put the Bobcats on his shoulders and win the game through the air? No. But if Mellott's going to pass that efficiently with the O-line Montana has, with the stable of running backs, including, Scott Trey Humphrey right now leads the Big Sky in rushing yards per game and has rushed for 7 touchdowns. With all that, if Montana State's also going to have a quarterback completing 7 out of every 10 passes, that's pretty damn tough to beat for anyone who's not just nationally elite. I think Montana State is pretty easily the most complete team in the Big Sky Conference right now. And I'm saying that as an Idaho fan who I like my Vandals, but Montana State doesn't have a ton of questions about who they are, what they do, or what developments the team really needs to maintain at this point. So, yeah, they do get, like I said, they got another cupcake in Northern Colorado, so they'll have another blowout win. But no matter what you say about strength of schedule, the name of the game is accrue FCS wins and get to the playoffs. And right now, Montana State is sitting at 5-0 with an FBS win. They'll be at 6-0 before the showdown with Idaho. That's pretty dang close to already having a stranglehold on the playoffs and, revenge in 2 weeks, plus hosting. The Montana State goal is not simply to make the playoffs. Montana State goal is to host through the semifinals.
And to beat Montana.
That too. But they're doing what they need. And, hey, Patty Frick saying, Mellott's arm has looked dang good, at least when he isn't under pressure, which everyone looks worse under pressure. But Patty's right, is Montana State has effectively kept Mellott from taking hits, and he's passing better than he's ever done before. So so Patty brings up the pressure, makes things a little hairy for him. You're right. Like, hey, don't just read the box scores. Keep in mind, Malott only throws the amount he does because he's best thrown around 20 times per game. Where the passing game is secondary. Montana State does not want to rely on his arm to win games, and they have not had to. But if he's gonna play the way he has, with the way he can run the ball, he's still rushed for 4 touchdowns this season. So yeah, man, it's hard for me to say much more about Montana State other than right now they've got the number 2 scoring offense in conference and the number 1 scoring defense in conference. What does that mean? They're pretty damn good. Or hey, they have the number 1 total offense in conference, just under 500 yards a game. And they have the number 1 total defense, giving up 276 yards per game. They're pretty dang close to doubling up teams on an average week. Yeah, that's dominance. So hey, Maclane, thanks for joining me. Before we call it a night, we got to talk just a little bit about the games to come next week. So what we're going to be paying attention to the most, obviously, Northern Colorado, Montana State, we have circled as the game of the week. But no, I think brain dead. Idaho at NAU right now is, probably the most interesting game on the week schedule, as in like, hey, can Idaho rebound? And is NAU, how for real is NAU? I think we find out a little bit more about that in Moscow this week. What other games do you have your eye on?
Before I get to the most obvious one for me, I think Weber State, Montana has the potential to be interesting. That is, of course, depending on how well Weber State rebounds and shows up. Obviously, Montana wants to win this game by a lot, especially against a Weber State team that's not looking that strong. I think it'll be interesting because we've talked about like sorting out like how good is Montana. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of see how that works out. I don't think UC Davis versus top 5 Portland State is particularly interesting, not to me at least. I do think Idaho State, Cal Poly, I hope that it's not going to be an interesting game. Now, the hope here, of course, is that Idaho State wins this by at least 2 scores. This is for as an ISU fan. So we have Cal Poly and then Portland State back to back, and which is great because we're just coming off of some of the toughest opponents that we've had we will have to play all year. Oregon State, North Dakota, and then Montana State. Those were, along with Idaho, would be the toughest games that we would have had all year. So from an Idaho State perspective, I don't know if at the start of the season I predicted 5 wins for ISU. I think that's still on the table if you've got Cal Poly, Portland State, and then maybe able to beat or upset NAU, Sac State, or Weber or Eastern. And then we'll get to Idaho when we get there. But from an ISU perspective, a chance to improve on the win-loss record of last year.
Well, yeah, to me, the ISU angle is, hey, I actually do think Idaho State's a pretty fun team to watch. When I'm not watching Idaho, they're one of the teams I'm most likely to just jump on that ESPN Plus stream for Idaho State to show that they've taken a step out of the bottom of the conference, that they have to win. They have to win the games against teams like Cal Poly, Portland State, and you want to see them do so convincingly. So other than that, I think Montana, Weber State is interesting. Combination of if Weber State's going to make the playoffs, they don't have much margin for error left. I don't think they're a playoff team at this point, but if they are, they've got to turn things around absolutely right away. So I guess that's the other game I'm looking at.
Yeah, and there's always we've talked about before. There's always kind of the FCS voter bias of like which teams have been done well historically. Like I think for a team like ISU to be able to make the playoffs or even receive votes in like the top 25, you need to kind of go and be above and beyond what like a different team would have to do.
Yeah, so hey, Patty's talking about Weber, saying if Weber lets Richie cook, they got a shot. Now, Patty, that also assumes that they're going to do something other than Mickey Mental has loved to have his quarterbacks throw short passes. But I don't think they necessarily have guys beyond Damon Banks and to take those short passes and turn them into something. I don't know if Mickey Mental has a changeup in his overall scheme to throw to do different than that, because that's kind of what they've done for the last while with mental. But anyway, Maclane, thanks for joining. You may be on some other time. Franklin Spicer in the comments section getting a little bit temperamental, a little bit touchy about some Idaho takes, some Montana State takes. I don't know, man. I just watched the game and talk about it. But Franklin, you are free to do your own Big Sky Power Ranking show. Actually, maybe we'll get you on sometime. I would be when Patty can't be here, and hey, Patty is going to be recovering from Aaron Best's post-traumatic stress disorder for a long time. We may need another host at some point, man. So maybe getting Franklin on here is the right call. Maybe he'll keep us on the hashtag right track, Trevin, if you're listening. But with that said, hey guys, thanks for joining. It's 11:19 p.m. my time. It is Monday, if you're Maclane. So we're going to call this a night. I'm going to now spend way too much time scrolling through our production stuff. I never know what I'm doing here. But we have to end the show at some point, meaning I have to find something to click on. Until next time, go Vandals.
Go Bengals.